Hey everyone, welcome back to Mangosteen. In this episode, I want to cover off a very simple, timeless wealth framework that you can take with you and share amongst yourself and all the future generations of your children that will apply no matter what time it is in human history, whether you're in the 500 years in the future or 1,000 years in the future. This framework will always be relevant. But first, in order to understand that framework, you need a brief history lesson. We have a brief modern history of sound money. Now, the gold standard has been used, debased, left, and then reinstituted many times throughout history. In the early 19th century, Britain adopts a gold standard, and in the 1870s, the USA adopts a gold standard after experimenting with silver. Upon the outbreak of World War I, most of these industrialized nations break from the gold standard in order to fund or finance the war, right? If they are funding it with gold, they run out, and so what they do is they break that gold standard and they fund it with paper. And then upon the conclusion of the war, they try to reinstitute a gold standard. But the UK found that it was destimulating the economy. They wanted their currency to be too strong, and they left again in the early 1930s. And that was a reason why Britain recovered much faster from the Great Depression, right? Because they allowed easy money to be available. Whereas France, who tried to hold on to their gold standard for an additional 5 or 6 more years, had to endure a lot more worse depression effects. And New Zealand and Australia left the gold standard along with Britain around the same time. Now, at the end of World War II, we did have a reinstitution of the gold standard called the Bretton Woods system, which was a sort of a US-led gold standard that started from the end of World War I and existed up until the early 1970s. And we're going to go through that in a bit more detail now. This is a simple and timeless framework for wealth. And what we can see is we can see a sound money phase and a fiat money phase and operating in a cycle. And that cycle operates through different time periods. And the most recent one is obviously the early sound period of the 1940s when the Bretton Woods system was established, which lasted until 1971, where it collapsed when Nixon closed the gold window, and we created an early fiat system starting from the 1970s up to present. And this cycle occurs throughout human history. Like if you go back 2,000 years, there are periods of like sound money or like precious metal money that then gets debased or you know, in some capacity, maybe they dilute the silver content or the precious metal content, or they clip the coins or something, which creates a sort of fiat money cycle. And throughout these periods, there's been some basic things to do. So throughout a sound money period, you know, boomers were coming of age at the very late period of the sound money system, right? And were brought up by parents who existed entirely through a sound money period. And what did those parents have? What did the silent generation value? They really valued working and saving, right? They thought about saving and working and conserving what they owned and not spending frivolously, right? Because the money was valuable and it was scarce. And that's the sort of mentality that boomers were brought up with from their parents. And so what happened in the early 70s is we had this early fiat system. The money system broke. Prior to that, banking was very boring. I mean, if you watch The Great Short at the very beginning of that movie, they're discussing how boring banking is in the early 1970s, precisely because there was a sound money standard. Banking was very hard to make any money out of. You couldn't just wholesale credit create. Whereas now in the early fiat system, banking becomes sexy. There's a lot more money floating around. And so what you had is you had these, you know, boomers who grew up with a sound money system in their childhood, who believed in money, and they thought they were making more money through this mentality of like buying scarce assets with leverage and extracting rent or income, usually in the form of property, but they also bought shares. And throughout their life, this has served them really well. If they always bought houses, leveraged up, kept their debt levels high, and traded up through the property ladder, they made a lot of money. And so you've got boomers who lived through a fiat game with a stable belief in money, and that wealth could be created by this sort of, you know, bunny ears investing. And where we are today is we're here in this sort of late stage fiat system where we're going to go back towards this focus on your craft, work and save, money is scarce, don't spend frivolously mentality as we transition into a new sound money system. And so the key thing here is, you know, if you're a young, 25-year-old, 30-year-old, or even 35-year-old and you feel locked out of the property market, it's key to identify this cycle and identify that we're in this part of the cycle right now. And the opportunity is to, rather than try and play that game that your parents were so successful at, is to play the game that is going to come up in the future, which is this new sound money system, and to take advantage of that. And so this is where focusing on your craft, getting really good at what you're doing, working and saving is going to be key, not going into ridiculous amounts of debt to buy property when global demographics are collapsing and it needs huge amounts of stimulus in order to maintain the property Ponzi scheme, right? So this is the opportunity, and this is what I recommend you do. I recommend you recognize that we're going into a sound money system, work and save. And when you save in sound money, which, is going to be Bitcoin, right? Or you could save in gold or just some sort of scarce asset, but I would recommend Bitcoin. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm going to link my rinse series at the top right, which is for anyone who's interested in going deeper into how I've come up with this framework and the justifications and reasons why I've come up with sound money and fiat money and how this is all working out. Rinse goes into it in a lot of detail, so I hope you appreciate that content. And of course, finally, nothing I provide is financial advice. This channel doesn't provide any financial advice. Do your own research. This is entertainment only, and you are listening to a random mangosteen on the internet.